All right, so last thing here to hit on, the last thing to wrap up spring here in Nashville. Let's kick it over to our interview with Gentry Estes of the Tennessean. All right, we're pleased to be joined for the first time by Gentry Estes. He's a sports columnist for the Tennessean, and you got to give him a follow at Gentry_Estes. Gentry, thank you so much for joining me, man. I really appreciate you.
Sure. Good to be with you.
You put in your headline here, Hope Springs Eternal for Vanderbilt football, and finally for a good reason. Of course, spring football, we're all in a good mood. We're all thinking our teams are going to be better than they were last year. But, based on your story there for the Tennessean, there's actually hope for Vanderbilt football for the first time. So how much progress do you see coming in the second season under Clark Lee for the Commodores?
I feel like it's they had an encouraging spring, and as I wrote, you're never going to hear a team say they had a bad spring. But when you watched Vanderbilt, they had some roster turnover, but a lot of the key guys from last season they were able to get back. That was number one. When you watch them play, they just seem to be playing at a different speed and confidence this spring than they had for a lot of last season. I think some of that has to do, obviously, with being in the second year of a scheme and with a coach, and I think expected. But in Vanderbilt's case, it was encouraging to see. I don't know what the upside is at Vanderbilt versus some other schools in the conference. Obviously, is it 4-8, 5-7, that kind of thing? That would probably be where I would put the over under, but that's better than last season. They went 2-10 last season. I do think they're going to be a good bit better, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And again, they've got some key guys back in a full recruiting class coming in. So I don't think they're going to be all the way there yet, but better.
And how surprised were you that, considering how rough of a debut it was for Clark Lee and company, that, there were some defections. Of course, they just had an offensive tackle that left for Alabama. But how surprised were you that they've been able to keep as much talent this offseason as they did?
I was a little surprised. I think you expect anytime when you see a coach come in, you usually see attrition after the first season, before the second season. It's pretty common that you're going to see that. And especially in this age of the transfer portal. I mean, I truly was kind of bracing for a lot of turnover at Vanderbilt. And there was some, but quite honestly, not as much as I expected, and not as much as I would have expected with some key positions. I mean, this can all change tomorrow, obviously, but for 2 years now, they have returned both quarterbacks in Ken Seals and Mike Wright. I think that's kind of a neat trick there that they weren't, one of them didn't choose to transfer during all this. And I think the first year that could have been Mike Wright, because Ken Seals was kind of the guy in Derek Mason's last season. Then this last season, Ken Seals dealt with some injuries, and Mike Wright was kind of the quarterback. So, you assume, well, maybe Ken Seals goes somewhere else. He hasn't yet. He was here this spring. They also brought in a pretty good freshman quarterback in A.J. Swan. So they've got some good depth at quarterback, number one. I feel like the skill positions still pretty good. They've got a pretty promising freshman and a kid named Jaden McGowan from South Carolina. He had a very early enrollee, had a very impressive spring. I think he's going to be a playmaker. They get the ball in his hands quite a bit this year. So, I think that's, you bring in some new guys in addition to a lot of the key guys that they brought back, and defensive side of the ball, kind of at all three levels. They've got some guys who played some football for them. So I think depth's an issue. I think they could get better on both lines of scrimmage. That was kind of the case last year as well. But if you were to list off the players and say, here's the ones Vandy would most want to keep, more than I would have thought.
Mm-hmm. And, you hit on the quarterbacks there. Of course, Mike Wright. I watched the spring game. He looks like potentially your most explosive player, of course, at quarterback, but maybe in the entire roster. And then Ken Seals, maybe a little bit more polished, maybe a little bit more prototypical, what you want in the SEC. But given Vanderbilt's issues on the offensive line last season, Mike Wright certainly thrived, I thought, a lot better than Ken Seals. Does that dynamic, the fact that they do different things, do you think that plays a part in why they're both still there and they're both vying for that starting role?
Possibly, and I think there is a good bit of truth to that. But I think, Ken Seals was awfully impressive as a freshman in that last season with Derek Mason. He was one of the few bright spots on what was just an awful season in the pandemic year for Vanderbilt. And again, you mentioned the offensive line. Well, it was a train wreck his first season. He was getting all kinds of punishment and still playing remarkable, all things considered. Last season, the offensive line didn't really improve as much as you would probably hope from that. It was still an issue all season. And I do think, Ken Seals was the starter when the season began, and he dealt with some injuries. And I do think Mike Wright's ability to escape pressure was pretty useful, really, in their offense last season, given the fact that both quarterbacks just pretty much had no chance about half the time. I mean, in all honesty, and I think Mike Wright had some escapability and kind of made some plays outside the pocket, and I think he got more comfortable as the season went along. And I think Vanderbilt's team got more comfortable. They played better over the course of last season. They almost won a game at South Carolina. They played Ole Miss a lot closer than they probably had anybody would have expected, and Mike Wright had a lot to do with that. He's a very strong leader for this team, and I think Ken Seals is too. And they've been fortunate to keep them both around.
Now, you mentioned the freshman receiver Jaden McGowan. You like what you're seeing from him, but how about Will Sheppard? I mean, he was making some big plays this spring. Particularly, I'm talking about the spring game where he looks like a legitimate go-to receiver in this offense. Do you think he's going to be the man on the outside for the Vanderbilt Commodores?
He's their best receiver, no question. Certainly coming back from last year. And, really, the receiving core last year was better than I think it got credit. There was more talent in that group than you would expect. And Will Sheppard was a big part of that. The ability to bring him back, I think, is a big part of that passing game. They've got a few other guys. I mentioned McGowan and some others maybe not quite as experienced, but they've got some talent out on the perimeter. They really do. And they have all their running backs back as well. So the skill positions are okay. I think where this is going to hinge on Vanderbilt's real improvement offensively is going to be up front. I think that's still your big question mark, and it's going to be hard for a team to. I do think they're going to win a few games here and there that maybe people don't expect them to. But if you're really going to contend and challenge some of the better teams in this conference, you have got to be better up front than I think they have been, and quite honestly, are probably going to be this season.
Mm-hmm. And now you wrote about the defense, Clark Lee. That's why we're bringing him in here to fix his defense. Pretty rough debut, but you said they may not look like an SEC team talent-wise, but they act like one. And I got to be honest with you, Gentry, I can't remember the last time I watched a spring game where we had defensive players getting unnecessary roughness. I mean, they were throwing blows, they were talking crap in between plays. Are you seeing that from the defense? Are you liking what you see? Or you think they've got that edge that Clark Lee wants them on that side of the ball?
More so than last season, I do. There was a lot of the scrimmage that I wrote from in seeing that. They were very aggressive on the defensive side of the ball, and Clark Lee referenced this as well. A lot of gang tackling, a lot of rallying to the football, and just a confident looking group. They were proactive in how they were playing as opposed to being reactive. And I think some of that is just a comfortability in what they were doing defensively, but also I think there's an urgency to their play that has been developed over the course of the last year. And I think they're playing to a standard a lot better than they were certainly at the start of last season. And, and some of that's personnel. They brought in a transfer from Clemson, Kane Patterson, and as a linebacker in the middle of the defense. And, I think the secondary, really at all three levels, they've got guys back who were pretty key to what they were doing last year. And the defense at times played pretty well. I mean, Clark Lee's a guy who was a defense coordinator at Notre Dame for some very, very good teams, playoff teams. So I think you've got a good scheme and a guy who knows what he's doing on that side of the ball. The trick is and will continue to be talent. But, Anthony Orji was probably the best player on the team, in my opinion, last year defensively. Elijah McAllister is another guy who was kind of in that same category. These are guys that could have gone to some pretty big time programs and contributed and started had they wanted to transfer, and they didn't transfer. That to me is probably the best sign of what they're building at Vanderbilt, because after a team that didn't win and didn't win a game in 2020 and then went 2-10 last year, losing to ETSU to start the season, you're still able to keep the program together enough to where all these key players didn't want to leave and didn't view their best future to be somewhere else, that they could get certainly a lot more wins. But I think that above anything kind of shows what's being built there, just in terms of a confidence standpoint, because this is a program that the results on the field, you would have suggested that some players like of that caliber might have been looking elsewhere.
In your mind, how big is the season opener loom on the season? It's a road trip to Hawaii. You reference it there. They lost the first game last year, ETSU. That had to just kind of spiraled the positivity they had coming into the debut of the Clark Lee era. They've got to continue this positive momentum they've got this offseason. So how big is that Hawaii game?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's a lot different. I think they're going to go out, I don't know, 10 days a week before that game and practice for a week in Hawaii and kind of enjoy. I mean, you're talking about a team that didn't have a bowl trip to end last season, right? So I think this is going to kind of be a reward, so to speak, to start the season, and they planned it out that way. I think it's smart. I expect Vanderbilt to go out there and play pretty well. I mean, the follow up to what happened when they lost to that game against ETSU last year, I think it ended up being somewhat of a wake up call for a team that had gone through the motions a little bit in the preseason and then learned real quick that it was going to take more for them to actually be competitive. And I think it said a lot about their character, if not in resiliency, if nothing else. At the very next week, they went to Colorado State and won a game on the road after that. I wouldn't have picked that. I did not think that was going to happen, and it did. So, that's a team that went on the road and kind of found itself a little bit. I think that's kind of what they're hoping happens again, going out to Hawaii, and obviously a fun place to be and practice and get ready for that first game.
All right, last thing for you, Gentry. I really appreciate all your time. We're looking ahead to the schedule. If Vanderbilt is going to be taken seriously, they got to be a lot more competitive in conference play. Like you referenced, they almost knocked off South Carolina. They had some good showings late in the season. If you had to pick one conference game that Vanderbilt is most likely to win next season, which game are you going with?
South Carolina, to me, would be the most winnable of the group, probably, if only because Vanderbilt had that was a toss-up in Columbia last season. Vanderbilt was in that game late, kind of let it get away at the end. Now Carolina will be coming back to Nashville this season, and I know they bring in Spencer Rattler and a team, and see a reason why they shouldn't mention them here. Florida has a new coach coming in. How are they going to be in year one with Billy Napier? That could be another one. But I do envision another year where conference victories would be few and far between for Vanderbilt, but it wouldn't surprise me if they get one or two.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks again, Gentry. I really appreciate you. Sports columnist for the Tennessean. Give him a follow at Gentry_Estes. Thank you for all the Vanderbilt knowledge.
All right. Take care.
All right, so just want to say thanks to Gentry for hopping on the line. I think Vanderbilt truly will win an SEC game this season. I think they're going to snap the streak. They're going to get somebody, at least one, if not two, SEC games. And if they're able to do that and win out in the non-conference, which is going to be difficult the way they schedule, they need to schedule more cupcakes until further notice. But if they can do that, pull off some stunners, maybe go to a bowl game, that would be huge for this Clark Lee program in year two, given what he inherited and how awful they started out with that ETSU opening season loss. I had no idea Vanderbilt was going out to Hawaii a little bit early. Love that move, but let's hope they don't party too hard because they got a game. If they drop the opener to Hawaii, it's going to be another long year for the Commodores. So let's hope they open the season by whooping Hawaii's ass here. But hey, that's going to do it for this episode of the show. We got one more coming, going to preview all the spring game action we've got on Saturday. So stick with us here. I really appreciate each and every one of you that continue to show up, even when we're talking Vanderbilt football. Hey, they're in the SEC too. They deserve some coverage. So, but that is going to do it on this episode of the show. We'll catch you on the next one. Hope I didn't lose too many of you by talking some Vanderbilt football, but